Funding for the Think podcast comes from Wise, an app for people using money around the globe. With the Wise account, you can send, spend, and receive in up to 40 currencies. You can download the Wise app or learn more at wise.com. Terms and conditions apply.
The scholar Carol Anderson coined the term white rage to describe the predictable backlash every time Black Americans inch closer toward equality with white Americans. The way the Jim Crow South rose up to trample Reconstruction, the rise of hate crimes after the election of Barack Obama, and calls to take back the country in the wake of Black Lives Matter. And maybe the phenomenon is not limited to gains in racial equality. In response to the hard-won gains of feminism, there is masculinism. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. We can see this trend in the misogynist ideas promoted by the manosphere, that women ought to leave the workforce to concentrate on pleasing husbands and raising children. As my guest has learned, there are even some influencers trying to make the case that the 19th Amendment was a mistake. Helen Lewis is a staff writer at The Atlantic, and she's a host of podcasts at the BBC. Her book is called The Genius Myth. Her article for The Atlantic that we're talking about today is called The Men Who Want Women to Be Quiet. Helen, welcome back to Think.
Thank you very much for having me.
You call masculinism both serious and silly. What do you mean by that?
Right. Well, there is a kind of trolling, performative quality to a lot of the things that some of these guys will say. You know, they will kind of raise the possibility of, as you say, repealing the 19th Amendment. Now, you know, that would require 2/3 of the states to sign off on a constitutional amendment. It's a really tough uphill climb thing to do, but it's kind of done to sort of say this is the destination, right? This is the direction of travel. So it's it's at the same time a kind of serious thing that lots of these people do believe would be a better way of governing America, but it's also designed to kind of entrap liberals and feminists into arguing with something and looking like they're Chicken Little running around warning that the sky is going to fall in.
So it's a way basically of humiliating liberals and feminists by getting them upset.
Yeah, and also to be an edgelord, which is so much of a strain through that MAGA online right. You know, the idea that you just deliberately say things that are rude or uncivil or would have previously been ruled out of bounds for racism or sexism or anti-Semitism, that you're doing it to prove that, you know, no one can tell you what to do. You know, it's kind of sometimes there's a kind of a touch of like, you're not my real mum to it. You know, you can't make me go to my room. There's almost this kind of slightly sort of teenage rebellious quality to it, like a kind of middle finger quality. And that's part of that's part of the performance. It's designed to appeal to people who feel that they have been downtrodden by a kind of stifling conformity, liberal spaces. You know, if they're men, that, you know, the idea that feminists have really had the upper hand for too long. And no one's talking about men or men's problems. And, you know, there are people who feel like that. Lots and lots of them in America. You know, some of them, one of the big reasons why they voted for Donald Trump. So we kind of shouldn't be surprised that this style and presentation and this ideology are quite widely appealing.
One of the people you write about here is this pastor from Moscow, Idaho, named Douglas Wilson. I mean, that description is accurate, and yet it might also give the impression that his influence is pretty limited. He's built up a kind of empire of institutions to support his vision, right?
Yeah, I think he's a very underrated character in American public life right now. So in the 90s, for example, he was very influential in the Christian homeschooling movement. But he also has a streaming platform because it's 2026. He has a publishing house, you know, where he puts out books. Several of his family members, his wife and his daughters also write books about, you know, proper conduct for Christian women. And he's got 170 churches in his denomination planted all across America, including one that is attended by the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who invited Douglas Wilson to come in and talk in the Pentagon recently, where he told his audience they should be, it was either unapologetic or unembarrassed Christians at work. Now, Douglas Wilson's vision for the US is a very strongly held, genuinely held, but very particular one. He wants a theocracy, and particularly not even a Christian one, a Protestant one. He's described his politics as paleo-Confederate. And, you know, I think he would probably describe himself as a patriarch. He is patriarchal. He believes in biblical patriarchy. He thinks that men are the head of the household and women's job is to be the kind of helpmeet and supporter of their husbands.
So I didn't really know anything about him. And reading about him, what really disturbed me is that you also describe him as Twinkly and avuncular. Like he has, I guess, a sort of a folksy demeanor.
Yeah, and he's written like a billion Kindle books, right? This is somebody who, in some ways, he reminds me of a kind of old school year 2000s blogger. And he is a blogger, right? He writes hundreds of thousands of words over at his blog. And he also went on a speaking tour back in the 2000s with Christopher Hitchens, the new atheist, where they kind of slugged it out about whether or not God was real or not. He's somebody who's definitely got a touch of the showman in him. And he can be charming. He can be quite scary. I imagine if you cross him, he's somebody with extremely strongly held views and strongly expressed opinions. But I was really interested in to what extent a lot of figures from masculinism are playing a kind of cartoon version of themselves on the internet. So I think, people might think I'm whitewashing people with views that they find appalling. What I'm trying to do is convey to you, who these people are and how they function in society. And for lots of the people that I spoke to, having a kind of internet persona is a really big deal.
Do you think that kind of folksy persona makes his ideas seem less threatening and therefore maybe more appealing to people who might not automatically say, we don't want women to have the right to vote?
Absolutely. I mean, you'll know this from years as a journalist, but there's two ways of asking a controversial or conflict drawing question. One is the very harsh attacking question, the kind of where you just sort of harangue somebody. And the other thing is asking them something very tough to answer, like, and when do you think that the money went missing? But doing it in a kind of flat affect that doesn't sort of imply that you're trying to catch them out. And there's a similar thing. It can be quite hard for us to distinguish between the mode of something and the kind of message that's within it. And I think for him, coming across as this kind of fire breathing demagogue, but also this kind of, twinkly granddad kind of figure, sort of kind of slightly jams people's signals. And they don't know to what extent is he saying things for effect? Is this just about being a kind of, controversialist on the internet? How serious a program for government is this? And what I was trying to do is say both of those things are true. He can be both very charming. He's obviously a very intelligent guy, but also he's very serious. If he were given, absolute dominion over America, it would be a Calvinist theocracy. It would be something a bit more like 1650s Massachusetts. And so you have to decide whether that's what you want too. And there's no amount of him being, pleasant to deal with that, that should kind of rebuff you from arguing back if that's not what you want.
Well, you say what you want. I mean, you and I are both women. Are the women in his congregation in a position to say, this doesn't work for us?
Well, his wife, as I say, and his daughters write books. There's a certain kind of family atmosphere enterprise about it, but there are situations in which people have raised very serious concerns about the way that his church is run. In one very notorious incident, which people can find quite heavily documented on the internet, there was a guy who was convicted of child molestation in the congregation. And somebody else within that congregation, with Doug Wilson's blessing, set him up with a young woman in the congregation, and they had a child together. And the guy was subsequently not allowed to be alone with this child because of fears that he was molesting the kid too. Now, I my reading of that incident really is that that congregation, as a patriarchal institution, prioritized the rehabilitation of a sex offender over the safety and dignity of a woman and child. So, you can find accounts on the internet from people who have left that Moscow congregation who found it really very unpleasant, very domineering, very controlling. There is a persistent strain of accusations from women that their allegations of sexual harassment weren't taken seriously, which is something that you would absolutely expect to be a complaint in a situation where men are in charge and women are supposed to be obedient. When that goes wrong, that's what that looks like.
Is there a significant difference between what we're calling masculinism and what many people know as patriarchy? Is masculinism just a new way to describe patriarchy?
It's a good question. I mean, I tried to find a word to use that would be kind of fresh to people so they didn't bring a load of baggage to it, but also maybe that the people involved would recognize themselves. I didn't want to caricature their views. One of the things that The Atlantic says when you join, which I think is a brilliant motif for journalism, is try and argue with the best version of your opponent's case. Try and represent the views of people you disagree with in ways that they themselves would recognize. And so, I consider myself a feminist. I've written a book on feminism. I tried to be fair to people while making it very clear where my intellectual and personal disagreements are with them. And so I thought that the word masculinism, which has been around for quite a while now, is quite helpful in doing that because it's not the manosphere, which we tend to think of as kind of influencers who are just algorithm jockeys. And it's not kind of patriarchy, which is a more of a kind of structural system where people are talking about. I'm talking about individual actors who, some of them are very Christian influenced. The words from the title, the Be Quiet, come from the letters of St. Paul, who said godly women should be quiet. But there are plenty of secular ones, and there are some nominally Muslim ones too, like Andrew Tate or Sneaker or Myron Gaines of the Fresh and Fit podcast. So I wanted to give people the sense of a kind of intellectual movement that is hopping on this particular time in American culture and has a very coherent ideology and philosophy behind it that, they might not have seen all of the pieces of the jigsaw in the same place before.
Do the proponents of this, the male proponents who do seem to have a coherent ideology behind their views, like what is their sense of their obligation to the women and girls in their lives for whom presumably they are making decisions?
Well, I mean, I think the way that they would argue it is that they think that this more traditional way of life, traditional gender roles make women happier. So a couple of things, they think that modern women are, very likely to report anxiety. Now that's not untrue. There are a lot of women with anxiety diagnosis. We might have a separate conversation about whether the kind of over medicalization of American life, but also the fact that there were plenty of women who were, unhappy before. It's not like feminism happened and then suddenly women, suddenly were viciously unhappy in ways that they hadn't been before. So, but their argument is really essentially that, things like the rates of women on antidepressants are proof that modern life and feminism haven't worked out well for women. And they point to all of those kind of things as saying, well, kind of, wouldn't you like to come back and be looked after by a husband? You should be cherished. You should be the apple of his eye. This is the kind of sort of tradwife sales pitch, is that is having a career really all that fulfilling? Do you want to go and sit in a job and earn money for someone else when you could be the heart of the home and a mother adored by her children? So that is very much the sales pitch, which they genuinely believe. And there are, what, plenty of people around them, women around them who've voluntarily signed up to this code. So it's not a kind of completely unreasonable argument. I think that's one of the things that it picks on, these anxieties about modern life that I think lots of us share. I'm sure you know people with anxiety. I do. I know you. I'm sure you know people who are worried. They don't feel that their job is particularly fulfilling, and they think, is there more to life? And when people feel like that, the masculinists are there to say, well, there's a reason for that. It's because feminism has gone too far. It's because you're doing something you're not naturally suited to do, and you'd be happier with this other type of life.
I did think it was interesting, he said, like, look at the 1850s. No woman was on antidepressants, and your retort was like, they didn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, but that is genuinely the kind of the sort of evidentiary base behind it, because we do know that mental health diagnoses have gone up quite significantly in recent years. We know that more liberals than conservatives report mental health issues. Now, all of those data are kind of arguable, right? Because one of the things you could say on the other way back is maybe people who are on the liberal side of politics feel less stigma about talking about, say, having depression, whereas it's kind of seen as, you just need to man up on the conservative side. But that's, that's the evidentiary basis that they're working off. They also point to things like they believe that women have more empathy. Women are kinder naturally and more empathetic. And that means that's very good if you're a mother, but that's very bad if you're in a position of authority. And so this argument comes that, and that's a flip side of an argument that feminists have made. They said the man's world's very tough and run in this very cutthroat way, and wouldn't you like to have a kind of feminine touch to it? And they flip that and say, no, we wouldn't. That would be bad because you'd have decisions that were made on the basis of feeling sorry for people, not on the basis of kind of rules and laws.
Helen, it turns out to be pretty easy to sell the idea that men are routinely oppressed in our society. What kinds of evidence do proponents of masculinism present to demonstrate how big a problem this has become?
Well, one of the things that's often advanced is the kind of male suicide rates are higher than female suicide rates. We have lots of young men reporting that they don't have very many friends, for example. male mental health issues. More men are problem gamblers. All of these kind of things. And there are also more men doing the very, very dangerous jobs. So if you look at the list of America's top 10 most dangerous jobs, you probably include like deep sea divers or commercial fishermen. All these kind of things. Those industries are very heavily dominated by men. So, and I'm not for a second saying that any of those problems aren't real or legitimate, but they are kind of advanced as saying we've had all this discussion about all the things, sexual harassment, rape, women struggling to get promoted at work. Where's the space for discussion in this culture for men? And the other thing that they raise, which is not in itself an illegitimate point, is the idea that actually maybe masculinity itself has become slightly unfashionable in some liberal circles. The idea of risk taking or, you know, ambition, domineering nature. These are things that some bits of the left find quite uncomfortable. And actually, they would say, this is what men are naturally kind of supposed to do. The trouble with it is, I think that bit of the analysis is not unreasonable. But the bit that always I find missing, particularly on the MAGA right, is the idea that if you're strong, you should be a protector. Instead, the version seems to be if you're strong, you should dominate the weak. And those are, you can have the same fundamental analysis that, if you are born with the type of body that gives you much greater upper body strength or whatever it might be, then your role in life should be to look after and enforce the kind of fairness rather than just take whatever you want because you're physically dominant. And that, those are two competing versions of masculinity. But a lot of the people in this space have drifted into the kind of second one. They want to live in a world that is very much about cutthroat competition, and they think men are better than women. White people of European descent are better than black people of African descent. They live in a world of very rigid hierarchies.
I think this is so interesting. You remind us in this piece that, many people think about the rise of MAGA having been fueled by white outrage over the election of a black president. It's really hard to dispute that. However, since those early days, a lot of MAGA folks have realized they could build a bigger tent by turning on women.
Right, and I think you've seen it with the crackdown on illegal immigration. That the way that what happened in Minnesota actually really did make Donald Trump lose a lot of the gains that he had made in the 2024 election with young Hispanic men in particular. But he also made gains with young black men too. That there was a feeling that, hang on a minute, we sort of thought you were doing this kind of stuff for effect. We didn't really think you were going to pick up people that we know. Whereas the thing is that actually the masculinism piece is still very, very popular. And Trump, has a very male dominated coalition. I think the gender gap in voting was in double digits in the last election. And there's an understanding that actually, some of this stuff is, again, kind of for effect. And some of it's about being allowed to be kind of an edgy boy on the internet, essentially. But yeah, I was kind of surprised when I thought about it because so many of the manosphere influencers are mixed race or minority that it's often described as this very straightforwardly white nationalist movement. But Andrew Tate is mixed race and British American. Sneeko is, I think, of Filipino descent. Myron Gaines is Sudanese American. You have very, very big figures in this movement who are not white in like the WASP's kind of old-fashioned sense. But the thing that they do have commonality with is that they all think that kind of we've had a few too many lectures from women in HR, and that's just a very, and I think that's some women go along with that thesis too. The idea that women are kind of naggy and scoldy, and hectoring and won't let you do what you want. That set of ideas has much broader appeal than actually some of the race-based stuff, which has proved to be quite a turn-off in action.
What is the relationship between the ideas of a Douglas Wilson, who is a pastor in his 70s, and a manosphere superstar like Nick Fuentes?
Well, Douglas Wilson would say nothing. He was very, very critical of Nick Fuentes. Their big point of ideological difference, I think, is Israel. And like a lot of evangelical Christians, I think Douglas Wilson is, his baseline assumption is a relative level of support for Israel, whereas Nick Fuentes is, he is absolutely of the conspiracist bent that thinks that kind of, Israel and Jewish people are, a sort of evil cabal who are influencing American foreign policy in nefarious ways. So there is that very obvious point of difference between them. And the other thing is that, it's quite funny to hear Douglas Wilson say that Nick Fuentes' language is kind of gauche. When Douglas Wilson has, called women small-breasted biddies on his blog, he's not someone I would say who is what particularly worried about offending people. But his defense of that is that he knows where the line is. Nick Fuentes doesn't know where the line is. And the line that I quote from Fuentes in my piece is him saying, we should send women should be sent to the breeding gulags. Just like Hitler destroyed his enemies, the communists, the gypsies, the Jews, we should put women in gulags and then let the good ones out. But this is kind of, this is, I think, language that is actually quite repellent even to lots of people within MAGA. But the thing is, they don't care enough to kick him out of the tent over it. His comments on Jews when he had the interview with Tucker Carlson a while ago did cause a real stink in MAGA. But you can say these kind of things about women, and it's kind of understood that, yeah, these are a bit, below the salt, but there's not a reason to kick someone out of the tent.
You think that some masculinist writers who have been or have been now like empowered to go public with their thoughts rather than keeping them under wraps or expressing them using pseudonyms. Tell us the story of Charles Cornish Dale.
So Charles Cornishdale, like me, is British. He has got PhD and further study from both Oxford and Cambridge universities, generally regarded as our two best universities. So he is somebody who absolutely succeeded academically in a sort of straightforward way. His PhD thesis is on Wimborne Minster in the Middle Ages. So he could have been a kind of very straightforward medieval historian. But he has this other side to him, and his online persona is called Raw Egg Nationalist. And so one of the things you have to do is slonk raw eggs. That's the correct verb, apparently, for eating raw eggs in order to have enough protein. I know no one ever said that being a masculinist would be easy, Chris, but this is what you have to do.
I mean, can't you just cook them first? But anyway, continue.
No, absolutely not. Unless you're risking salmonella, it's just not butch enough. So you have to get all your protein, which again is the idea is that this boosts your testosterone, which is your thymos, your masculine life force. And then you body build and you're strong and you work out and you hang out with other guys. And he combines this with very hard right anti-immigration politics. So I find him this very curious figure. I could have happily talked to him about medieval history for hours, but then on the internet, he's playing this provocateur role that is deliberately offensive and racially charged. And it's kind of hard to see how the two sides of the character mix up, except that one of the things that he described to me was, when he was at Oxford, he was there during the Brexit referendum, the EU referendum, where Britain voted to leave the European Union. And he told me that the day after it happened, everybody was very upset. There were people who were kind of crying because they thought that their life was over, and the country wasn't the place they'd lived in. And his reaction to that was to find it sort of weird and amusing, and to laugh at these people who, as he saw it, were being kind of sort of hysterically overwrought. And that sort of sent him and spun him off in the other direction. He's ended up working for Alex Jones's InfoWars and becoming quite big in the United States.
It really is interesting the way like misogyny seems to fold very nicely in with other kinds of bias.
Yeah, it was something I was kind of keen to make the point in the article that there are versions of, lots of other groups can be designated kind of unmanly and therefore kind of second class citizens. So a classic example would be, liberals have got low testosterone, therefore liberal men are unmanly. Jews in the kind of anti-Semitic stereotype, they're clever, they're bookkeepers, they're not athletic, they're nerdy, they're nebbish. So that's kind of they're unmanly too. Um, then you get the opposite prejudice that's applied to black men, right, who are kind of seen as hyper masculine, sexually aggressive, a threat to white women, and that's something therefore white men must step up to protect white women from. And there's just lots of the way that you see Muslims talked about on X now is very much as like an invasion force of rapists coming into Europe, essentially. So there is a kind of gender dimension to lots of these other prejudices that kind of run through the new online right.
A figure like Scott Yenor is really interesting, certainly contributing to this sense that modern women are the root of problems. I mean, what are some corrective policy proposals that people in this space think are a good idea?
So Scott Yenor has just joined the Heritage Foundation. He's also a politics professor, also in Idaho. And his feeling is he has this great line, very quotable line, that modern women are, let me get this right, medicated, meddlesome, and quarrelsome, which is one of those things that you sort of imagine lots of feminists writing on a t-shirt to kind of reclaim.
All
But
right.
anyway, this is the thesis is essentially that women have become kind of unfeminine and they're kind of hysterical. He's sent emails that were found in a FOIA request that where he sort of talked about the fact the universities have become a gynocracy because they're so many of the professors and administrators are women. So he essentially sees himself kind of drowning in this feminized bureaucracy of American life. And he wants a corrective to that. There's a speech that he gave where he said we shouldn't be encouraging more women to become engineers. We should be asking more from men who want to become engineers. So he's very much in the vein of a kind of anti diversity activist, right? He's not I think he goes beyond opposing affirmative action, which, as a policy has proved unpopular with Americans. But he goes beyond that to actually, he kind of wants affirmative action for men, essentially. So he would like America to consider paying a family wage, which is essentially where you give preference to married men, pay them more so that they can keep a wife at home who doesn't have to work. Preference for married men in hiring or salary negotiations. And that's of a piece with lots of stuff that you find in the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, which was kind of a blueprint for a second Trump term, which Trump rejected during the campaign but has embraced in office. And that was all, as my colleague David Graham put it in his book, around this kind of blueprint of a male breadwinner and a female homemaker. And that's the desired state of society that lots of people within Heritage would like America to get back to.
Helen, I mean, I'm curious about, whether is heritage very specific about like it needs to be a male breadwinner and a female staying home, or would they be open to, additional support for families where it is the woman partner who goes to work and the man who stays home?
From reading their documents, I don't get the feeling that they take a gender neutral view, that they would just like one parent home with the kids. The way that you see it often represented in conservative Christian circles is essentially this kind of complementary view that men are made to go out and be ambitious and fight in the world, and women are made to stay home and be nurturing. And that leads to other criticisms, for example, being uneasy with gay families, right? Because of the belief that there are two different roles there of mother and father, and that children need them both. Two fathers is just not the same somehow. So yeah, no, it's not gender neutral policy making in that sense. It's not like just like we think, which I think is a feminist is a perfectly reasonable thing to say. America is very bad at supporting families with very young children, and it would be nice for young children to have a parent or caregiver, give them more, be able to give them more time at the start of their lives. I don't think there's that many people that would disagree with that. But for them, it takes a step further into the fact that that is the specifically maternal role that they want to preserve.
What would you say, Helen, is behind the particular ire at women who do not have any children?
Yeah, I mean, you see this in from everything from, J.D. Vance, who was quite well read in these circles when he had a go at childless cat ladies, you know. And there's some very spicy quotes from Scott Yenna that I have in the piece too, where he talks about barren apparatchiks, these kind of and childless scolds. So there is a feeling essentially, and I think it's kind of it comes down to a sort of weird evolutionary psychology reading, which is essentially that without deprived of their proper maternal role, women become kind of monstrous and unfeminine. And that you get lots of criticisms about, that they'll end up having cats, right? Which is the idea that, they haven't done the proper thing, which is direct their love and care towards a baby. So they're doing this sort of fake version of it with a pet instead. But also you can see that it's pretty threatening in the sense that, one of the things that helped, still helps men in their 30s get on in the workplace is that suddenly a lot of their female peers are trying to, juggle the second shift. And so if there are more childless women about, that is more competition for men. And then there is just the feeling that, it's sort of not fair that these women aren't kind of aren't doing their bit to maintain birth rates, which is a big obsession of the new right. The idea that birth rates are falling, particularly in the developed world compared with the developing world, and that kind of imperils civilization. So at the same time, while not being particularly interested in the carrots that you might offer in order to try and induce the birth rate, they're very interested in how do you reshape society to make that expectation of having children higher, and maybe even looking at some of the sticks that you might do by sort of shaming women for not having children.
Do these men who hold these views lay out specific expectations for the obligations of men?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the nicest form of it, and again, this is not completely legitimate, they talk about the fact that men do have a responsibility to look after women. I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because where's the line between looking after your family and controlling them? And if you are having the situation in which your family is financially dependent on you, they'd be ruined without you, then is that looking after or is that a position of power that you've been put in over them? But the idea is that, men should strive to be ambitious. They should have the manly, masculine virtues about risk taking and strength. And we should acknowledge that they have this kind of will to dominate and excel and be involved in competitions. And we shouldn't be down on masculine aggression because that's actually what's driven society forward. And so lots of them are very interested in the Spartans, for example, this kind of idea of a kind of warrior race. I'm not, I'm always very open to a conversation about the fact that we should value men more. But some of them are this very, I'm going to say nostalgic, but it's not even that. It's nostalgia for a time that has never existed, essentially.
Helen, you cite this survey of Republican men under 50 who overwhelmingly, I think more than 80%, agree that
Mm.
society is becoming too feminized. I'm not sure I know what that means.
I mean, in its crudest form, it's the idea that women are now in positions of political power, that women can now be judges, that women can now be top professors, that the kind of, they can be CEOs. All of these opportunities that were traditionally denied to women are now open to them. But on a broader level, it's the idea that culture within lots of institutions has essentially become feminine. And everything that's associated with femininity in this is negative, right? So it's about being weak, being passive aggressive, being snipey and bitchy, not settling your arguments, like proper manly chaps, about being more interested in everybody getting along than truth. So the kind of text for this is an essay by a writer called Helen Andrews called The Great Feminization, in which she argues that greater numbers of women in the law, for example, are a quote unquote threat to civilization. The idea being that women feel a bit too sorry for violent criminals and are more likely to kind of go easy on them, give them easy sentences. Or the idea that you get bias in scientific research because people are no longer looking for the truth if the truth reports things that will make people feel uncomfortable. So these are the kind of arguments that culture itself has become less risk taking, less willing to cause offense. The way they basically say it is that they say wokeness was feminine, and this is the kind of great bogeyman of the 2010s and early 2020s that everybody revolted against. It was like basically the whole world had become a sort of nagging HR department that was dedicated to keeping people sort of miserable and repressed.
Well, it's an interesting argument to make if you don't want to even force yourself to ask the question of whether this is something that society ought to change. I mean, if you can just say, I won't even bother because this is a thing for the ladies, I mean, it gets you right off the hook of even giving that any intellectual space in your life.
Right, but there is a kind of the flip side to it, which is that there have been times when feminists have argued that the greater feminization of society would do some of these things. They think that they're good. So one example I'd give from Britain is the former deputy leader of the Labour Party, Harriet Harman, once said, the Lehman Brothers crash, the big financial crash, wouldn't have happened if it was Lehman sisters. This idea that when women ruled the world or having more women in positions of power, you wouldn't get this sort of macho swaggery risk taking. So, she saw that as a good thing. The masculinists agree with that thesis that women will change the culture of an organization, but to them, it's a very, very bad thing. And I have to say, I don't know about you. I've worked in mostly male dominated institutions. I went to a all girls school.
I did too.
I kind of I kind of like I like a balance, I think that the best places I've been have had a kind of healthy gender balance. So I can see in both sense like the critics of very, very male dominated workplaces and the things that can go wrong there. And I can also see that, when you get a lot of girls together, things can get quite emotionally intense. So it's not that I completely reject these criticisms. I think that in the case of the Andrews essay, I would be really interested to look at the actual evidence that we have on it. And for example, you could do that. You could look about at sentencing remarks of male judges and female judges and whether or not there is any kind of deviation between them. That would be an interesting piece of research to do. I'm not aware that we actually have that as it stands. So it's kind of really it's more of a vibey argument at the moment.
I mean, how much of this is just about the things we choose to define as masculine or feminine? I mean, thinking back to my own parents, I mean, my father was a heterosexual man and he went to work in the sort of traditional way. He had a kind of a feminine, what we might consider a feminine softness and sweetness about him when it came to raising his kids. It's like we've put guardrails around things and attached gender to them that may or may not really mean anything.
So, my dad both loved playing sports. He's a big cricket fan, but I seen him play with his grandchildren when they were really small, and he was radiating love and care and affection, and which was a very empathetic way. My own husband both runs ultra marathons, for fun apparently, and loves romantic comedies. Most of us are a kind of mix of qualities. We have personalities. We're not a kind of a Ken doll or a Barbie. We're kind of blend in a mixture. And I think there's also something kind of pernicious underneath this, which is the attempt just to wholly make feminine be bad and weak. And I don't think that's any better for society than the attempt to try and portray all masculinity as toxic, really.
You looked at Andrew Wilson's performance on the Joe Rogan podcast. First of all, is Andrew Wilson any relation whatsoever to Douglas Wilson, who we've already been talking about?
Not that I know of. So, Andrew Wilson is a Christian debater. He runs an online debating course that he sells to young men. And he's what's called the kind of blood sports debater, which means that there's kind of absolutely nothing is off limits. It really just prioritizes, dunking on people, just going as low as you can. You win the argument by any means possible. But he's a frequent guest on a podcast that I've become slightly alarmingly concerned with, which I sort of think is everything that I hate about the internet. It's called Whatever. It started off as a kind of prank show and then a dating show. And the essential format is that the host is a guy called Brian Atlas, and he will invite 7 or 8 young women, models, OnlyFans girls, onto the show and ask them questions about dating and modern life. They're often, I think, set up to look pretty stupid. They kind of get sort of trapped into saying that they'd only really considered dating a millionaire, and then they're kind of held up as being, well, you're only a 5 out of 10. You don't have any right to say that. And then sometimes Andrew Wilson is brought on to kind of argue with them about feminism. And he's a very intimidating persona. And he can often be just flat out kind of mean and rude in a way that I personally find absolutely repellent. I mean, clearly because there is an audience for it, but I just, it's like, why would you choose to spend time with someone who's just kind of perpetually angry and cross all the time? But anyway, he has a lot of criticisms of feminism. But he was recently invited to appear on Joe Rogan's podcast, probably if one of, if not the most popular podcast in America. And the difference in tone in the way that he talked to Joe Rogan to how he talks to these kind of 22-year-old cam girls was just extraordinary to me. He was sort of almost sort of bowing and scraping and tugging his forelock like a medieval peasant in the presence of his baron. And it was a very striking kind of insight into people, people's different personas in different situations. But his wife, Rachel, they have, as they present it, a very traditional marriage. And she has written a book about how the roots of feminism are in the occult. And I couldn't honestly say that I'd recommend reading it, but certainly was eye-opening.
So, what you're describing, I mean, it doesn't really reflect the way I see the world, but it sounds more like a form of entertainment than about somebody legitimately trying to make political points and convince people to think like they do.
Right, but yeah, but also to smack people down, which, if you've ever spent any time perusing YouTube thumbnails and headlines, there's a lot of kind of X person destroys this, such and such a person takes down woke feminist, that there's a lot of that kind of, for an audience of young men who maybe have been brought up in a kind of feminist settlement, whose parents are kind of okay with women in the workforce and all these advances that feminism has made. This is their version of punk. That's how often I think about it. This is their rebellion against the generation above them. I was really surprised by the fact we had a survey that I quoted in the piece that men from the baby boomer generation, so late, 45 and then 1950s births, they're more okay with the idea of men, taking time off work and changing nappies and all that kind of stuff than Gen Z American men report being. And that's kind of, that to me is a very interesting piece of backlash, I guess, to the undoubted gains of feminism since the second wave of the 1970s.
Does any of this, Helen, and I want to be careful here to make it clear that I am not blaming, gains made by women or feminists in general for the existence of this in society, but is there something about the way feminists have communicated their views in the public sphere that has laid the groundwork for this particular kind of backlash?
I mean, I attribute a lot of this pendulum back and forth, I think has been super, supercharged by social media because there's this phenomenon called nut picking, which is like cherry picking where you pick out unrepresented bits. But nut picking is when you pick the nuttiest opinions from the other side and you represent them as being indicative of everyone. And so what's happened is that, at the same time that, some really appalling things by men have been picked up in a way that makes, I think, men feel, well, hang on, I'm not like that. Why am I being lumped in with these, guys who harass people on the subway or whatever? Like, I would never do that. Then you get the same thing where some woman makes a video saying, we should kill all men as a kind of punky statement. And then that gets held up as like, this is what feminists really think. This is what they're teaching your children. And, some very lightly followed, possibly anonymous internet user is held up as being in some way emblematic of the whole of feminism. This is what feminists think. And that dynamic is just incredibly unhealthy. It's one of the things that I try and do is try and not kind of say people are saying, actually, well, who are the people? And so when I'm writing about the masculinists, I've been very careful to say, well, like, here are the names that you should know. These are some quotes, this is them in their own words. So, judge them on their own thing rather than kind of creating these kind of big, scary, faceless monsters. I would say that the reverse has not been true in the other direction. That you hear, well, feminists do this, feminists do that. And then you kind of go, well, who, Is it Gloria Steinem? Like, is it Hillary Clinton? Is it somebody I've heard of? And no, it turns out to be some 17-year-old posting in an internet forum. And it's very hard to argue on that basis.
Is there any evidence that like the overabundance of publicly expressed female empathy really has led good men astray or ruined? I mean, are the people who say like feminizing the workplace has ruined the workplace, has made people less productive? Has anyone come up with even a shred of evidence to demonstrate that this is true?
Well, I would say, and I've been very critical about some of the kind of cancellation campaigns of the 2010s. The question to me is whether or not there is anything kind of inherently feminine about them. Stalin cancelled a lot of people, if you want to describe it like that. So did Joseph McCarthy. Neither of them were particularly female, as far as I remember. So there may just have been this new form of kind of ostracism that came into the culture, I think, again, driven by social media, at the same time as you know, universities became, lots of universities now have a majority female undergraduate population, right? There are universities which are now putting the thumb on the scales in favor of getting more men in really quietly, even though, again, in both directions, that's unconstitutional. So, it's very hard to separate out what's just happening at the same time as something else and what's causing it. One of the big things that the right points to is they believe that the Democrats' border policies are essentially feminine. So, in their view, strong men say, "I know it's much tougher to live in Mexico than it is here, but tough luck." And they think that the feminine way to do it is to say, "Oh, we feel so very sorry for these people. You should all come into America. We can't possibly enforce a border." So, as they see it, there are, that excess of female empathy is a problem. It's kind of hard to say. We do know that more women support the Democratic Party, whereas the Trump Republican Party skews more towards the masculine. So this is always represented as any Democratic, any policy that's about kind of kindness or empathy is. And that is a Democrat policy is essentially attributed to the fact there's too many women in the party and they need to toughen up.
If the point of some of this is perhaps just going viral and getting attention, like what do proponents do once they have that attention?
Well, try and keep it and monetize it, really. I mean, I mentioned before that it was very interesting to me to learn that Andrew Wilson sells debate courses. So, he's the kind of proof of concept, right? Pay me money and you can be like me, and you too can, dunk on people on the internet. There's a very thriving publishing industry around this. I list some of the many, many titles that have been published and are clearly selling quite well because people keep bringing them out. So there's an enormous engine of commerce that underlies all of this. But then there are also people who are in think tanks who are thinking very seriously about how do you tweak the tax code, for example, or whatever it might be, that you translate through small incremental changes to American policy, make it friendlier to the type of society that you would want to have. And there are some people who are seriously thinking about the ways that they translate their vision of a more patriarchal America into making that the easiest way to live, the most frictionless way to live.
Helen Lewis is a journalist, author of the book The Genius Myth, and staff writer at The Atlantic, where you can read the article we've been talking about, The Men Who Want Women to Be Quiet. Helen, it's always nice to talk with you. Thank you for making time.
Thank you.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you get podcasts, or at think.kera.org. Again, I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.